BSides DC would like to thank all of our sponsors, and a special thank you to all of our speakers, volunteers, and organizers.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out today. My name is Mark Orlando. This is Brendan Denker. Today we're talking about automating analysis without automating the analyst. Just by way of background and introduction, both Brandon and I have an operations background, working in, around, building security operations teams, doing managed services, doing internal security teams, threat hunting, malware analysis, forensics, SOC automation. If it happens in a SOC, chances are we've done it at one point or another in our career. And we wanted to give this talk today because I think we're getting to a point now where there's a misconception that automation, particularly in the defensive context, is a product or it's a specific initiative. And I think both of us firmly believe that it is a process and should be a process to be applied in solving problems of all kinds and increasing the value that you can generate for your organization or your team. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about kind of a repeatable process that will enable you to do that. But before we get into that, I wanted to kind of step back a little bit and talk about sort of how we got here. And I refer to it as the automation imperative. Why is it so important? And I think for anyone who's doing this kind of work, whether it's defensive or offensive today, understands that you have to have some level of automation. You can't do everything yourself. And I think back when SOCs were really coming into vogue, the rallying cry was, we need all the data, right? Whatever you have, any log you can possibly generate, we need to get it. And today, I think it's a very different story. Everything is online now. So many more business processes are electronic or app-driven, and there's so much data. Obviously, it's very difficult to make any kind of sense of it or make use of it without some level of automation. I think most of us will accept that. So now, we're standing, particularly on the defensive side, we're standing atop this mountain of very, very important things, very, very important data. We have all these things, particularly in a SOC, that we just have to do, right? You've got to do monitoring, you've got to do analysis, you've got to do incident response, you probably have to do, some level of malware analysis, file analysis, and oh, by the way, answer the phones and answer the emails and whatever else happens, right? So suffice to say, we do have an imperative now, I think, to automate what we're doing in order to scale, in order to be effective. Okay, so that being said, I think we're still maybe a few years back in our history lesson now. So aren't we, for the most part, automating today on some level? How many of you in the audience, in your day-to-day work, are doing some sort of automation or taking advantage of an automated task of some sort? Most of us, right? Great. So why are we up here talking about the need for automation and a process to do it? And I included this quote from a Harvard Business Review article. And really what it's saying is, part of the problem with getting the value, maybe that we're not quite getting out of automation at this point, is that we tend to mechanize the old way of doing things. And I know, particularly on the defensive side, again, something that I've seen is that we're doing a lot of automation of old, kind of broken processes. We're just doing them faster, right? But we're not necessarily adding a lot of value. We're just looking to say, well, we've always done A and then B and then C, so now let me go buy something or let me go code something that's just gonna do A, B, and C, faster, maybe without me hitting a button to do B and C, right? That doesn't necessarily get you where you need to go. And I think the key message there is that all automation is not equal. Just because you can do something in an automated way or do it faster doesn't mean you're gonna be generating value, doesn't mean it's worth the time and the effort to put in. So, for example, automating some tasks might reduce risk, right? They might help you produce a more quality product. They might reduce variance and make things more consistent. But again, that doesn't mean that all of those things are providing equal value to your team or your organization. So over the next couple of minutes and few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about this kind of repeatable approach to identifying tasks to be automated, to prioritizing them, to executing that automation, and sort of measuring what you're doing in automating a given task. Brandon's going to come up and talk through some scenarios, some case studies that he's been through where these processes have been successfully applied, and we'll be drawing quite a bit, especially on the process side, from this book, Reinventing Jobs, which really is it's a text about all kinds of work automation, but I think it's particularly relevant to the work that we all do on a daily basis. So I just wanted to make sure I'm referencing that. And process-wise, we're really talking about kind of just a simple 5-step process to automation. And that process is this. First, we identify the opportunity, right? Seems kind of like a no-brainer. You find out what the opportunities are for automation, what the big problems are, the big challenges, and what you need to kind of attack first. You take that workflow or that task and you deconstruct it into its various subtasks or subparts. You consider the return on your investment for automating each of those individual subtasks. You think about what kind of automation you're going to have to apply to that problem. And then finally, you measure what you've done. You evaluate the impact of that automation. And what we're going for here is measurable improvement, right? We don't want to go back at the end of the day or week or month or year and say, well, we built this huge, awesome widget and it's super cool and it exists, and that's basically all you can say about it, right? We want measurable improvement, kind of calling back to the keynote from earlier this morning. We want to be able to speak the right language, right? We don't want to just be building widgets or scripts or programs just for the sake of doing it. We need to be able to speak the language to people who are not in the SOC or on your team or in your group, so they understand, what they're getting back for their investment in your time and the capability they're getting. Just by way of a disclaimer, I think for many of you who raised your hands a few minutes ago, who are kind of doing automation today, whether that's kind of like a micro automation where maybe you've written a script that goes and pulls some sort of information, corollary information, or gets you context, or does some research for you, or maybe you've got, automated email generation. Those kinds of sort of micro automations, they may not require some big 5-step process or some detailed analysis to execute, right? You might just be whipping those out, in an afternoon, and that's fine. That's a big part of the job. That's part of what makes it fun. But for larger, more complicated initiatives, particularly with kind of more complex tool sets, if we get into like machine learning, for example, those types of things where you're making a significant investment in time and effort, those things really do require more deliberate analysis and planning. And so that's kind of what we're going to focus on and try to exemplify today in our talk. Okay. So let's talk about this 5-step process and kind of how you walk through it. Identifying the opportunity requires something that is horrifying to, I think, most of us, which is we're going to have to go talk to people, have conversations, and if the team that you're helping, whether it's your own team or another team, if they're not bought into what you're doing, they're not going to use it. They might use it for a little while and then let it go by the wayside and all your effort is wasted, right? So it's really important to take that first step of gathering requirements, talking to your users, making sure that you're identifying things that are going to help them in their day-to-day, and use that as an input to the automation process. The second thing you're going to do is deconstruct that workflow into various subtasks, and you need to ask yourself some questions about those subtasks, right? Questions like, is the task repetitive or is it variable? Is it something that's going to happen the same way every single time, or is it something that's going to change depending on the situation or certain inputs or certain scenarios? Is the task independent or is it interactive? So is it something that I can just trigger a process and just let it go and give me the output or get to a certain end state that I desire? Or is it something that's going to require some user inputs, perhaps some interaction in order to kind of decide what tack to take or what actions to take, what information to get or tasks to perform? And then finally, and I think this is particularly relevant in defense, is it verbal or is it electronic in terms of orientation of the tasks? So does it require you interacting and talking to another group or a customer or a user, or is it something that is fully kind of programmatic, can just happen without any kind of back and forth interaction. So these factors are really going to influence whether or not a task is even appropriate for automation, and it's going to impact how difficult the task is to automate and where it should land in your priorities. When we talk about measuring automation, I think this is where a lot of us kind of tend to have challenges, because it's something that if you don't do it correctly, it can be arbitrary and it can be very subjective. I can say that, hey, I wrote this script and it helps me do this thing a whole lot faster, right? But I think what we've seen is that that's maybe not always the case, right? Some of that can vary from individual to individual. So you can't really just measure things based on time savings. You need to really look at the task and think about what improving that task really gets you. So let's step away from the automation part of it and just talk about improving a task, because really that's what this is all about at the end of the day, right? Improving the tasks that we're doing. And it's really kind of a scale, if you think about it in terms of, very minimally, improving a task can have negative value, which, despite the use of the term negative, it's not a bad thing. It just means you can improve a task so much, but once you improve the thing, there's really not anything else you can do with that. So in an operations context, an example might be doing quality assurance on a ticket that you would open, right? Or a case that you would open. Making sure it's complete, making sure it's accurate. That task has relatively negative value, because once I do those things, there's not a whole lot more I'm going to do to improve a ticket being complete and accurate. Either it is or it isn't. Going up the scale, a task improvement can have constant value, it can have incremental value. This really just describes the amount of value that I can get from improving a task more than one time. So for example, if I'm getting better visibility in my environment, if I'm an analyst, a SOC analyst, every time I improve my visibility, I'm going to get more value out of it. And really that's kind of a sliding scale that continues to go up over time. I always want to be making those improvements, right? I'm always going to get value out of expanding and extending my visibility. Intelligence is another example. If I'm getting more accurate, better, more specific, actionable intelligence, every time I add to that or improve that process, I'm probably going to get more value out of that. And then kind of at the top of the scale is this exponential value, where maybe I'm detecting something previously unknown or something that's really sophisticated, and that's exponential value, because every time I make a change there, I'm going to be doing something that is rare or enables some kind of creative performance. So that's kind of the sliding scale when we talk about return on improved performance that we get through automation. That's how we measure kind of the relative value of the improvements we're making. Okay. Not all automation is equal. Not all automation is the same. So in the case studies that Brandon's going to talk about in a few minutes, we're going to be focused more on robotic process automation, which is kind of the more standard, like programmatic automation. So you're writing a script, or you're doing a custom integration, or you're writing a program, or using a platform to automate a set of tasks. But there's also cognitive automation, where it requires user input to determine kind of which path you're going to go down and what automation you're going to do. There's collaborative, social, kind of robotic automation, which is more collaborative intelligence, artificial intelligence, where the entire process might change depending on certain variables or certain inputs over time. Right? Again, today we're going to be focused mostly on robotic process automation. I think that's probably what most of us deal with day to day in the kind of automation that we're working with. And then finally, we're all about results, right? So we want to measure the impact of the automation. Are we substituting a series of tasks in an automated way for something a human normally does manually? Are we augmenting what a human is doing manually, adding more information, adding more value to that set of tasks? Are we saving time so that new work and new value can be created, right? Are we getting things off of our plate so we can focus on other things, maybe that are more valuable or that are more suited to humans doing the task versus doing them programmatically, right? So that kind of summarizes that 5-step process and how we step through that. So now I'm going to hand it over to Brandon. He's going to walk through some examples of applying this process in an operational environment. Thanks.
So we have 2 case studies, and we kind of chose the case studies based off of where our analysts felt actually where we got the most impact and return, as well as to make it a little bit more relatable. So our first one is alert context, and again, we want to talk to our analysts. We want to figure out what is tedious in their daily lives, what do they just absolutely hate having to do every single time, as well as where can we potentially make the best improvement. So we found that it was tedious and time consuming. This happens almost every single time you have to triage an alert. You have to go do these steps. You have to find your historical context, learn from yourself. Unfortunately, many analysts will forget that process until they go down the deep, dark rabbit hole and then all of a sudden realize, well, that got written up about 4 hours ago. And now all that time is wasted. So, I need to gather identity information. So who is this? Who owns this device? What type of device is it? Can we even determine whether this threat is even applicable? And also find out related events. So when working with our analysts, we kind of came up with a high-level workflow, and it's intended to be a little bit more simplistic, and everyone's is going to be a little bit different based off of your processes, based off of your tools that you have, and how your analysts work within your environment. This is what we had when we went to our analysts. And we were able to identify 7 different tasks out of that entire workflow that we could chunk down and make more manageable. So we could start with just these ones, determine what their potential impact would be, what our return would be, and then start with those first before we look at this entire process and just think, let's just go create an entire automation for everything, where you try to do too much too fast. So walking through the first one, it's a repetitive, independent, electronic type of task where we're pulling the similar information. We're basically just changing the metadata that we're searching. And our next task is basically a way for us to potentially escape the entire rest of that data collection process, right? So when we work with our analysts, we actually even had to reorganize this a little bit to make this most sense where we can get the biggest bang for our buck, where if this was true, where we've already seen this, there's enough fields to say that we've already seen this, we've already determined this is a false positive, or we've already taken action on this. We can skip the entire rest of the data collection process, save ourselves some automation resources, as well as save us our own human resources. Because automation resources is still something we have to take into consideration when we're doing automation, because it still has a cost. So that one is variable, independent, electronic. Working down through the rest of it, where we're trying to identify the device owner, who's affected, as well as what are they potentially vulnerable to, gather that information so we can provide it to our analyst, which kind of leads into the next part, right? So where we have is this threat even applicable? Do we have an attack against a system that's not vulnerable for it, or do we have an attack against a system that's not even applicable? Again, try to escape that process as soon as possible so we can try to save ourselves some time on the back end. And then now we have our, we gather our log data from the SIM or log store, and we determine, that's when we start to actually do some of that analysis. So we can see we've tried to front load a lot of what we can and push the analysis a little bit further down. So now can we determine it's a false positive? What do we need to do with it before we actually go to the host and start gathering logs, memory captures, or whatever the case may be to help perform the completion of that analysis. So we were able to identify 4 tasks that are really good for automation. They're repetitive, they're independent, and electronic. We can potentially take these tasks and code them out and provide a lot more value to our analysts. And then we have one where we need to put a little bit more rules, bounds, some logic around that before we can continue with it, just to make sure that we don't automate something that we're not supposed to, and always err on the side of let's send it through the rest of the workflow just in case, because we don't want to make that mistake where we're trying to do too much. And our human breakpoints. And this one's really, really important to identify all of your human breakpoints where it's absolutely necessary within your process, because that's the whole point. We're trying to provide the information for the analyst to make the decision. There are some cases where, when you start talking with your analyst, that they're pretty much making the same decision based off the same set of results. You can try to automate that portion of it. But this is where we really determine that we need to actually stop at that point and let the human make the decision. So we've broken down all of our tasks. We have 7 different tasks that we might be able to automate, and we want to start adding information and determining our potential ROIP on it to start helping prioritize of where we want to start. So we have our historical context, it allows us to do a little more timely response. The biggest one is it allows us to reduce duplication of effort, right? And unfortunately, it does require some of API access to some of our tools. So it's important to capture those dependencies so you might have to go grab those dependencies and solve those first before you can start on this. And that helps some with your prioritization. Have we observed this before? The dependency is we have to have task 1 done first. So if we go down our automation process, this has to be done before we even consider the rest of it. And allows us to be a little bit more efficient and reduce some of that duplication of effort again. Device identity, as kind of talked about a little bit, it's basically a way for us to gather information on who's actually potentially affected. And again, we require some tool access. And when we're talking with our analysts, and again, this is going to be different for everybody depending on the tool set you have, how many logins you have. Sometimes to log in a single tool, you got to log into your SSO and then you got to log into the tool itself in some cases. So this was determined high difficulty based on the tool sets that they had to access. Is the threat applicable? And this is our human breakpoint, right? So we have to make sure that everything up until task 3 is completed before we even consider this. But again, this is one of those things where we have to make sure that the human is actually inserted into that process at that point. Then we want to gather our log data. Again, we need some tool API accesses. We get some incremental value, some more context. Allows us to make more efficient and consistent decisions based off of the data and the information that we're getting. And I think the big one for this one to point out is that we're getting consistent data set for analysis. So analysts will typically query a SIM in 3 or 4 or 5 different ways across your team. This will allow you to present information to your analysts in a clear and effective way where it's consistent through every single alert versus who knows what they ran. And if they still have to gather information, that's, so be it. And then is it false positive against is one of our human breakpoints, but we identified, before we get to this point, we need sufficient context and analysis before we can continue down our workflow. And lastly, we have our, gathering the host data. Typically this is a little bit more intrusive because we have to utilize an endpoint tool or scripts or some other fashion of gathering that information. And for us, it was a little bit more difficult because we had to actually execute some of those scripts and some of those, and access some of those tools. And sometimes it's not as clear as it should be. So we break it down, one by one, and we can kind of start to see that there's a lot of information that goes into this. There's a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of things that kind of make this seemingly simple process relatively complex. So this is one of the primary reasons why you want to kind of go through this exercise a little bit so we can start to determine where do we want to start and where are we going to get the biggest return, as well as, think about your analysts, what's going to make them happy as well, because, as Mark mentioned a little bit earlier, we need buy-in. If they don't like the tool, they're not going to use the tool at the end of the day. And we have to take that into consideration that we're doing something for them and not saying, here's a finished product, enjoy. Right? So we're able to determine historical context, kind of going back to us saying a little before was learn from ourselves. If we've already done the work, why do we do it again? And unfortunately, this happens all too often in the analyst process where you get so far down there because it's something cool, you really want to look at it, but then you realize someone else already did it, or we already had information on it and you just forgot to go get it. So that's where we get the biggest return. Is we can potentially exit our process as quickly as possible, save on human resources, save on automation resources, and then we have the rest of them that we put down in the list. So device identity, gathering our log data, have we observed this before, and then gathering our host data. So now that we've identified, we kind of go back to our graph here of our workflow. We've identified our 7 tasks, and then we've identified down from that 5 tasks that we can actually automate. And we've broken apart, we've determined where we want to start, and now we want to start determining how are we actually going to automate that. So there's the 4 tasks out of those 5 that we can use robotic process automation on. So we can put these through, basically feed it data, and we get data out. We don't necessarily have to do too much logic or too much things in between there, and it makes Makes it easy. And then we have our cognitive automation where we'll probably have to talk a little bit more to our analysts, figure out what kind of logic, what kind of bounds, rules do we need to put in place, again, with erring on the side of being safe, of always sending it back through the workflow to make sure we're not saying something's a false positive from previously when it really wasn't. And then this one this leads into like the next step is, what is our impact of automation? What is the return we're getting? We need to be able to present this in a manner that is ingestible. That is, we have to speak the same language. So we can condense down our big workflow into basically some simple steps, where we've taken all of our data collection, all of it assumedly automated, is now in one step, and then we have our cognitive automation under historical context. We still want to take that into consideration. We still have that breakpoint in there to, again, exit the process as soon as we can. And then we have our analysis, where our human has to do some of the review of that data and analyze the actual data there. And we can see how much more simple that process becomes with implementing some of this automation. Now we have to assess and make actually sure that we're actually getting what we expect from the actual automation that we're putting in place. Talk to your analysts, figure out how long it takes them to complete that task, and kind of get an idea so we can start putting some metrics in place to, again, make sure that we're actually getting some of that, what we expect out of that automation. And one of the things I think, tends to get forgotten is, what augments of a human would do, where if we're providing all this context up front, they don't have to go gather from the tool. Not only are we saving that time of them gathering it, but we're also helping them give that information so they don't have to go see 5 or 6 different tools and correlate themselves. Or gather that information, dump it onto a CSV, and make pretty pivot tables and add more information and context later, right? We're giving that information to the analyst in an ingestible format, so that's going to save them time on just performing that analysis in general. So we're reducing time and effort, and the big one, we're reducing the analyst fatigue. We're saving the time that they have to go and find that information, and it's gonna be a lot easier for them to work through that workflow. So kind of as a little bit bonus, I kind of wanted to show what we were able to do and how we kind of presented to the analysts a little bit. We're talking about a lot of data ingestion, we're talking about a lot of things, and you still have to consider what this actually looks like a little bit. So kind of quickly walk through, this is where we this is where we ended up storing our historical context in the various different tabs, and we wanted to summarize it there on the front for the analyst. Again, summarizing as much information as possible from our automation so they can see it straight up front. And then our event context, and the other, is a threat actually applicable, and so they can make a quick decision depending on what the actual type of alert that they're working through. And it's kind of an example pointing back to how we feel that alert context and what you've already done is so critical, where we can see in the beginning we had a not blocked trigger. Ours is blocked, you can see at the top, and it was already remediated. Same IP. And then we can also see that we have an assigned alert that came in a little bit before us, and that one has the same WScript message line there. It hasn't been resolved yet, so we need to work with that analyst. So we're not working in a bubble, right? So we can reduce that effort. We don't want him to perform the analysis and then us to perform the analysis, and then now we're duplicating that effort. And then same thing. Unfortunately, this happens all too often in the real world, where we go to ask to have an email removed because we found something malicious. Unfortunately, it doesn't take, it takes more than 5 or 10 minutes in some cases, and they had already clicked the link by the time we have it removed. Well, we gather all that information and that context straight up front so the analyst can move forward with their investigation. So our second case study is around intelligence research. This is, again, something extremely common that all of us have dealt with if you've been in the analyst world or in a SOC. And it kind of similar thing to what the alert context was, where it's a similar steps we're performing every single time. We're going through the same set of open source tools or paid subscriptions. We're dumping in an IP. We're trying to find the same similar data coming back. We're trying to gather the context of that indicator of compromise. We are trying to determine what is that threat, maybe some attribution in there if we can get it. Or a big one is, what is the capabilities? So what is it capable of doing to the affected user? Stealing passwords, so on and so forth. So again, everyone's process is gonna look a little bit different. This is what we culminated together with our analysts at a semi-high level, so that way we could start deconstructing the task and determining where do we want to start with our automation and make it manageable. So we were able to determine we had 6 potential steps that fell into potential automation. With our first task, we were able to determine it's repetitive, independent, electronic. This is gathering if you have process intelligence, if you have an intelligence team, or if you have an IOC database, and the other one here out to the left is going to be things you've already researched. Why burn your API 3 or 4 or 5 more times if you already have that data cached from 5, 10 minutes ago, maybe an hour ago? Search that data first, find out, make sure that you search it, and you can save yourself some API calls. And then, is context actually true? Did we actually find anything or find anything useful? And then this is where our first analyst breakpoint was, where we had to actually analyze the data we got back. Is the data that we pulled back sufficient enough to continue on with the analysis process? Or do we need to go gather some more data from open source and some of our paid subscriptions? And it's important to keep in mind this process here is basically, we broke it down to be one single IOC that goes through this each and every time, and we have to iterate through this process every time. And the idea is that we're gathering from our paid subscriptions, from our open source, and though even those have some limitations, on what is this threat about. And then down at the bottom, when we start talking to analysts, it's a natural progression to when you find an IOC, you go search for it, and then you find maybe 5 hashes or 5 domains associated with that, and then you go and search those, and you keep going down that rabbit hole, and that's where a lot of times we get lost. And we put this specifically in here to address some of that, was that we wanted to, is sufficient information there? Did we go sufficiently deep? In other words, do we have 3 resources that say it's all this same malware and it's all malicious and all have similar risk scores? They're 3 separate ones, they're not referencing each other. Okay, we can move on and not burn the rest of our API calls as necessary. So when we're finding some of the related infrastructure, we can ensure that we're being as efficient as possible. And then lastly, we have our actual analysis, is it a false positive? Do we need to continue on with it? Can we go ahead and exit our process? So as we did before, we want to break down and add in all of that information to help prioritize where we actually want to start. So here, we determined it was an incremental value. We still have to have API access, and we still have to have some of that historical and process intelligence in some way, shape, or form. It's context found. We have a dependency on task 1 for that one. Is sufficient context found, and this is going to be where our analyst actually has to step in, and it's that break point where we have to make sure before we go burn our APIs, before we go run all that information, do we actually need to do it? Do we have enough information that we can save ourselves on that? And then gathering the actual context, this does require some subscription APIs if you have those, and free and open source APIs. There's a ton of open source stuff. It's just a lot of times you have to hit 2 or 3 of them instead of just the one or 2. And this allows us to, the threat context allows more informed responses, and it reduces the tools the analyst would actually have to access. Sometimes it's 5 or 10, or sometimes have to use that one that they only use here and there. And then the sufficient depth check, kind of a little bit of what was mentioned before, was it allows us to extrapolate on indicator relationships and hopefully go down deep enough. In our particular workflow that we worked on, we found that 2 was actually sufficient if you had enough resources that you were checking. Where if you're checking 5 or 10 different resources, you typically only need to go another layer deep to actually determine is this actually malicious, so you can start that response process. And then checking if false positive is our last step, where the actual analysis comes into play. And again, it's seemingly a simple process, but as you start to put all of this extra stuff into it to help you prioritize, it becomes a little bit more complicated to know where do you actually want to start. So we were able to determine, our analysts actually kind of really wanted to gather the context and indicators, but that always comes at a resource cost. So it's something that we had to take in consideration, where we ended up gathering our known context first. Again, why search for something if you already have it in your database from an hour or two ago, or maybe a little bit longer? You have to kind of set that threshold for whatever you're comfortable with. More context allows us to make the better decisions, and it removes some of the variability. So as we did before, we kind of wanted to start to identify what type of automation we want to put in place for these particular tasks, and we identified these particular tasks so we can do some robotic automation, basically static. We can feed the same thing in, get the same thing out, and then give that to the analyst. And then we need to put a little bit of bounds around this. If two layers deep isn't deep enough for what you're looking for, then you might want to put in maybe even some logic around that to determine, I want to go one layer deeper based upon these five rules or 5 pieces of logic. And then, again, so we try to simplify it so we can start to see what kind of value we can actually get out of this, what the actual impact is. So, taking into consideration everything that we want to automate, we can throw basically all the data collection again into one little bubble, and with that depth check to make sure, and with that human stop point of sufficient context. And then, so we talked again with our analysts, when we started going through this process to determine how much time they spend on this so we can actually add some metrics to it. And reduces some effort and reduces our time to respond to threats, because we can find out, instead of an analyst taking 15 or 20 minutes to perform a task after they get their hands on an alert, they have that data there waiting for them, and they can potentially respond to that threat quicker than as if they had to go and do the research themselves. So it reduces our time there. And again, just kind of a little bit of an example of what that might look like to an analyst and how powerful this information can really kind of be. So we'll dump our known context again onto the other related records, and we're going to be focusing more on the OSINT that we're getting from our various different tasks and our tools that we have access to. So it's a lot of information to kind of look at first, but one of the things that we quickly discovered that was actually extremely beneficial to our analysts was kind of just grouping things into various different columns, right? And into our key fields. So as we can see here, we have a couple different IOCs that came back as TrickBot in this particular case, but we still want to look into those and just, as an analyst, just to make sure. We got plenty of hashes to go research if we wanted to research, and we've identified that these indicators are certainly suspicious, if not definitely malicious. So it gives us an opportunity to quickly identify this and start the response process as we dig in deeper. And with that, Mark.
Thanks, Brennan. So, these workflows and these tasks may or may not be representative of the kind of work that you all are doing on a daily basis, but I think some common pitfalls that we've run into, aside from some of the ones that Brandon mentioned during the case studies, you go through the trouble of applying some automation, writing a script, creating, a custom app or a custom integration. And a lot of times, you go through that entire exercise, you think you know what you're doing, you think you know what kind of impact it's going to have, only to find after the fact that it's, okay, well, the team's not really using it, or they don't use it every time. Sometimes they just go, do it manually, so it only has, partial kind of value add, or, it really doesn't provide the kind of return on investment that we expected to. It doesn't help us do this one thing faster or more effectively or more consistently. And in those cases, if you're not doing some analysis up front and you're not breaking it down kind of into its subparts and doing some of that legwork and some of that homework before you undertake that initiative, it can be really hard to go back through and say, well, why is that? right? Why isn't the team adopting it the way that we anticipated they would? Why is it not consistently doing the thing that we expected it to do? So hopefully some of the case studies illustrated kind of the value in doing that analysis and doing those breakdowns ahead of time, so that if you need to measure and adjust later, it's a little bit easier to do as opposed to just creating, some black box. If any of you have done any work with like artificial intelligence, there's this concept of explainability, right, and transparency. People have to understand what the thing is doing and how it's working, and that plays into not only kind of managing that automation or managing that application on an ongoing basis, but also training your staff, training the users to understand, when they click this button or, when they execute that automated task, what actually is happening under the hood, so that they can give you the kind of detailed feedback you're going to need to make sure that you're enabling them. Another kind of risk in doing any kind of automation that people don't often think about is, aside from the upfront work of actually building the thing, there's that ongoing engineering support and maintenance. Right, so I'm sure many of us have things in our organization that some really smart person built or did, and now they're long gone, and you just kind of don't touch it and stay away from it, and don't ask too many questions about how it works. It just kind of does, right? So you got to think about like that ongoing ownership and maintenance. And also, I know no one in this room would ever do this, but technical people sometimes can like go down really deep rabbit hole, right? We can like find a cool problem or like a cool platform, and we can take like 4 times as much time as we anticipated kind of doing that. So again, part of the reason for doing some of this analysis and breaking down some of these tasks this way and looking at the problems this way is to avoid doing too much and to avoid trying to take on kind of too much and letting perfect be the enemy of good when all you're doing is trying to add incremental value. So hopefully some takeaways from this talk. Again, automation should be a process. It should be a way that you improve value. It should not be a product that you buy and jam into your environment to do a thing. Maybe a product is part of your strategy in automating. Maybe it's part of that process, but it's not kind of the end in and of itself. Repeatable agile processes, like I'm a huge fan, Brandon's a huge fan. They help us avoid those rabbit holes. They help us make sure that we're getting return on our investment, whether that's investment in a paid service that we're using where we have to be judicious about how we hit those APIs, whether it's return on people investment that we're getting out of the folks that we're relying on to build some of these integrations. Priorities are really important. Not all improvements provide equal value. So sometimes we get so wrapped up in understanding that we're doing a cool thing, or we're building a widget that's going to do this automation that we weren't doing before. We don't always ask the hard questions about is that going to be more valuable than focusing on a different widget, or focusing on just handling this task manually for now because we have other priorities, right? So priorities are important. One thing that if you wanted to leave here this weekend and go back into work on Monday morning, and try to apply some of this, again, it doesn't take some sort of formal, rigorous process to start to ask some of these questions and start to apply some of this stuff. Take any automation initiative, either that you already have operationally in your environment, or that you're thinking about or planning or working on. Try to go through this exercise. Try to go through those steps. Try to quantify kind of the value that improving whatever that task has for the organization. Try to break it down into its subtasks. Try to really understand, and make sure that all that stuff is aligned, right? See if maybe there's something that's been missed or overlooked. And that's kind of even just a mental exercise that you can go through and apply some of these concepts. Okay. So that takes us to the end of our talk. Thank you very much. Both Brandon and I are on Twitter. Brandon's a lurker mostly, but you can find us both there. And with that, happy to answer any questions or talk to you after. But thank you.